Washington get-togethers. Now, why is this important in U.S. China relations? I think that there has been a generational change, at least on the American side, and I'll leave it up to Professor Ran to characterize the Chinese side. 50 years ago, if a young American was interested in China and wanted to have a career as a sinologist, there weren't very many tracks that were open. You could be a diplomat, perhaps a journalist or a scholar. That was about it. And you probably didn't have a chance to spend much time on the Chinese mainland or to engage with the Chinese people. You would watch China from Taiwan or Hong Kong or the United States. And so this extremely accomplished and experienced and brilliant generation of sinologists, for them, because they were denied access to China, China was often a studied object. But for the young people now who can live in China, China is a lived subject. We've been there in some cases for decades. Chinese have been our friends. They have been our colleagues, in some cases our spouses. People have a chance to carry out projects in China, and they have all different kinds of ways to be involved with China rather than the old traditional sinological paths. And we need to bring these voices of experience in China and these different professional experiences into this dialogue, so that on the American side we had people in security, but we had people on the business side and on the environmental side, on the cultural side. So we're trying to mix it up and doing it, and to do this bilingually. I think we had a very good start, and we're happy to have this chance to share our experience and our views on U.S.-China relations with you today. We've asked 4 of our conferees to speak with you today. First, Dr. Ran Zongze, who is the Vice President and a Senior Research Fellow at the China Institute for International Studies. He also has long experience as a diplomat as well as an academic, and is one of China's leading America watchers. When I lived in China and would flip through the stations, I would sometimes see him commenting very ably on American presidential elections and other issues. So welcome, Dr. Ran. We will then hear second from Dr. Oriana Mastro, who is Assistant Professor of Security Studies at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. And personally, I was very glad to have this chance to be in a conference with you, because we've never had a sustained conversation in English before. We've been appearing together on the Voice of America China branch, talking about these issues for years, but I've never really heard you present in English. You were marvelous, so thank you. Third will be Li Haidong, who is a PhD supervisor in the Institute of International Relations at China Foreign Affairs University. And then last, we will have Dr. Melanie Hart, who is a senior policy analyst for Chinese energy and climate policy at the Center for American Progress. So without further ado, I will turn it over to the 4 of you in that order, and then we will have a chance for discussion with the audience. So once again, welcome. Dr. Ran.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Danny. Thank you, everyone, for your coming and for your presence. I'd like very much to start the conversation by giving me my initial thought about the new model of major power relationship. Well, this has been a pioneering job, in my point of view, for both China and the United States. We never see this kind of effort before. Of course, I cannot say there will be new efforts in the future. But the point is that both China and the United States are so different, right? Everybody can identify that we have numerous differences. But in the same time, we share a tremendous growing convergence of interest. And this is growing business. So both sides cannot afford to engage a kind of confrontational manner with each other. As a matter of fact, currently, the best way to advance our security, to advance our interest, is by cooperating with each other to identify the convergence of interest. Of course, my second point, and it needs to tango. This is not a unilateral action from either Chinese side or American side. It definitely needs both China and the United States to work together. Of course, in the same time, welcome others' positive engagement with that, because this is not only just a China-U.S. business. It is also a business. Everybody has a stake in this. And of course, having said this, we do have a historical moment or opportunity for engaging, for forging this new type of major power relationship. China, from this year for China is of great significance. First of all, we have the new team, Xi Jinping as the head of the new team. And also we have just concluded the third plenum, and it lay out the future reform blueprint for China. Of course, Obama here kicked off his second term. So we do have a very good opportunity here. And having said this, I'm not going to shy away from the differences and also the problems. Some of them are very fundamental differences. The differences, I think, basically two things. The first one is a kind of distrust with each other because we're so different with each other. So it automatically generates lots of distrust or unease with each other. And the problem we asked during the conference is actually what does America want from this new type of major power relationship? The same question asked for Chinese. What does China really want from this new type of major power relationship? So we compare the notes. And secondly, I think the approach is also a challenge for us. This is basically a top-down approach. We have a notion, a narrative created such as a new type of major power relationship. We still don't know what the substance. What we are working on is try to work out the substance, to make it look like something which is valuable. This is more or less the Chinese way, by the way. America is a bottom-up approach. Lots of accumulated work, research has been done. All of a sudden, you have an idea. So this is what we really want. So how to reconcile with these two approaches? Probably each side, we should make our own efforts, meeting in the central point, like the Annenberg. I mean, Xi Jinping's meeting with President Obama. We choose California as the meeting rather than Beijing or Washington. We come to the central part and to meet with each other. So I think finally, I really appreciate, I'm looking forward to any kind of question and comments you have. I'll do my best to address some of your concerns and questions. Thank you.
Oriana.
All right, thank you, and thank you all for coming. Of course, as is always the case, everything I'm going to say now represents only my personal views and none of those of the institutions or government bureaucracies of which I represent in other situations. Today was a really great day, I think. I always, when I come together with Chinese counterparts and other people who study U.S.-China relations, I feel like how I felt in high school when I would spend my summers at band camp, which was all during the high school year. Everyone thought I was kind of strange, and I was interested in things no one else was. And it was only those couple months that I felt like, wow, there are other people like me. And so even though we are different nationalities, when we get in a room, you have this group of people that live and breathe U.S.-China relations. And what's really interesting is how much we have in common, and more importantly, how there's no hostility in discussing very sensitive issues. It's never the case that everyone's nodding their head at the same time, but no one's throwing anything either. And so it actually leads to, I think, some really interesting insights for the relationship. I've come away feeling like we have to have a new type of relationship between China and the United States. But so far, we haven't come up with the right answer yet. There's a number of reasons for this. First and foremost, I think as we think about it now, the new type of major power relationship, we're trying to figure out how we see U.S.-China relations. We know it's not like the United States and the Soviet Union, right? Because we don't have that hostility. We don't see China as a global ideological threat, though sometimes they can see us as the only ideological power in the system, and sometimes they're right about that. But there isn't that hostility. But we're also not like the United States or Great Britain, in which we have a natural affinity for one another. So when we talk about how we're going to deal with this relationship, it becomes much more complicated, I think, than so far as slogans allow for. We also introduce the additional factor of timing. China is a rising power, but China has not risen yet. And at what point in time do we have to start, when we start thinking about the relationship, how do we understand where the United States is and where China is, given that it's so dynamic and given that the power differential is changing, though in some areas that gap is still very large. What we have so far as part of the conversation, I think, is not useful. In Washington, you go to a lot of events about U.S. China relations, and we can talk about, for example, the framework of strategic distrust. Is this a useful framework for thinking about the bilateral relationship? And I think no. I think what we learned today in the room sitting together, it's not that we have this irrational distrust of one another that is driving our decisions. It's not that I can't possibly understand where China is coming from. In many cases, I would feel the same exact way if I were the Chinese government. It's not that I don't understand, it's that we have a conflict of interest in a lot of areas that the United States and China are currently operating in. And I think that that conflict of interest comes from the fundamental hope on China's part that they will be a dominant regional power in Asia. And they would feel a lot more comfortable if the United States military wasn't so dominant and so close and encircling and surrounding and operating all the time. And those things are hard to reconcile. And the sooner we are honest about the fact that it's not that we misunderstand each other's positions, but that maybe we just don't like them, I think the sooner we can move past some of these tensions and actually move to some of the areas of cooperation. I also think another framework I hear a lot about, economic ties. Economic ties guarantee peaceful U.S.-China relations. I think this is actually a very dangerous idea as well. And in question and answer, I can go into more detail about the actual trends, but it doesn't look like the closer we get economically, the more peaceful we're becoming towards one another. The people ties are not showing some of the trends we'd hope for. It looks like actually the more people interact with each other around the whole region, this is not just U.S. China, but including India, Vietnam, Japan, the more they realize they don't like each other. We also see that even as trade goes up between countries, the security relationships between China and some of its neighbors have gotten worse as trade has gone up. I see this argument in the United States as an excuse. It's a lazy idea that I've heard when we want to talk about hard security issues. It's a wave of the hand to say, we don't have to worry about that because the United States and China are such large trading partners that we'd never fight each other. I think if we're honest about our conflicts of interest and we have these interactions which we can learn what each side wants, and then we try to think of good strategies and good ways to manage those problems, that is the only way we're going to get at the ultimate goal of what this new type of major power relationship is. As I mentioned, I don't think this formulation is the best formulation, and I think peace is very easy as long as you always accommodate the other side's interests. So you can't only look for peace, you also want to protect your interests. And I think this dialogue was a good start of both sides learning and making our way to a new type of formulation to figure out how can both countries protect their interests in the situation in which you have changing power differentials over time and have it lead to something that avoids conflict, not only for the two countries, but also, as someone mentioned in the conference, this is probably the #1 gift we can give to the region and to the world, is for us to figure it out. So my bottom line is, I guess, I don't think we figured it out yet. Unfortunately, in the 2-day time, we didn't figure it out. But what I learned was that we hadn't figured it out yet. And so hopefully, once we sit down in more conferences and more talks, we'll come up with the right formulation because it's that important. I think we have to. Thank you.
Professor Lee.
Okay. Thank you, Robert. Thank you for all who are sitting here. Actually, what's the new model of major country relations? Actually, Chinese leaders succinctly summarize the core elements of the new model of China-U.S. major country relationship as follows. First, no conflict, no confrontation. Second is mutual respect. The third is achieving win-win result through cooperation. Actually, the former two are means and final elements is the goal.
Actually, these three elements actually are the product of the profound reflection on past two countries' relations and will guide their relations now and in the years to come. However, we noticed many people in the world doubt the feasibility of the establishment of this new model of major power relationship. Then the question arises, can this kind of new model of major country relationship successfully be built? The answer is straightforward. Yes, we can. Okay. History reveals a lot. Okay. History of the two-country relations has demonstrated both countries actually are a partner, reliable partner in crucial and difficult times. Through close relations, close cooperation with China, the United States solved Vietnam conundrum in 1970s, brought Soviet Russia down in 1980s and 1990s, achieved its victory in defending terrorism, and will recover itself from current economic distress, and now and in the years to come. And it is the same case for China. Actually, partly with the U.S. encouragement in the 1970s and 1980s. China implemented far-reaching comprehensive reform and opening up a policy, and China joined the international system in which China and the United States are all stakeholders in the 1990s and earlier 21st centuries. And now China has been a major country with global influence in the world. So there is no reason for both China and the United States not to consolidate and continue building this model of major country relationship now and in the future. However, we must be frank with the sources of potentially destabilizing, ongoing, constructing mutual beneficial relations. Actually, given the time limitation, I just list two major destabilizing sources that U.S. side brings about in building a new model of major country relationship, so that our U.S. partner can have more angles to reflect on the two countries' relations. The first is U.S. frequently misjudge China's intention. Actually, there are so many such cases. Here, just choose one. Many people here hold the view that rising China is marginalizing U.S. influence and interest in East Asia through challenging status quo or changing status quo. Actually, this is kind of a misjudgment. Actually, China itself is facing daunting challenges of pushing her economy forward or developing its economy and maintaining stability within China. And China has no any intention of damaging U.S. interests of East Asia, and because China, just as the United States, has very high stakes in maintaining East Asia's regional order, which was established through series of declaration and proclamation by the United States, China, so many countries who had made huge sacrifice in World War II. Okay, that kind of regional order benefits China and the United States. Okay, and the second is that the oversizing role of the value in U.S. policy toward China. United States is very fascinating in transforming China, okay, and it has a tendency of defining a country with different value from U.S. as a competitor or adversary. That is a tendency. Actually, China itself, China's values, okay, rooted in its long history, and it indeed different from the United States. However, China cherishes the idea of harmony based on the coexistence of various values. In comparison, United States adhere to the idea of harmony based on the common value. So in U.S. foreign policy toward China, there is a consistent theme that is either transforming China or confronting China. This phenomenon actually confused many Chinese. We also think about it. Okay, actually looking at the future of China-U.S. relations, the daunting and urgent challenge, based on my observation, is to find a strategic base for cooperation as early as possible. Actually, this strategic base should be based on common interests instead of common threats. Okay, during the Cold War, the common threat actually constitute the solid strategic base for the two countries' cooperation. And in the post-Cold War era, the economy constitutes a kind of strategic basis. However, now common threat gone and the economic cooperation is filled with frictions. So it's time for us to find a new strategic base. And this strategic base, based on my observation, should be defined as the overall stability of the international system and its gradual and peaceful evolution. For China, China has achieved its impressive success enjoying contemporary international system, and China is not only more prosperous but also stronger. Therefore, China has no any intention of changing the current international system. Rather, China has sufficient ground for maintaining the stability of the current international system in which the U.S. actually exerting leadership. In the meantime, the world is changing rapidly, that the current international system should evolve gradually to reflect the trend of our time and to guarantee the flexibility and the resilience of the international system in which China and the United States have high stakes. In brief, new model of major country relationship serves fundamental interests of the two countries, and it is my sincere wish that the new model of major country relationship could bear fruit. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lee. Melanie.
So thanks very much for inviting me to speak on behalf of our really spectacular group. And I should follow Oriana in specifying that I'm sharing my own personal views and in no way representing the views of my institution or my colleagues. I think this particular dialogue has been fascinating for me because it has really driven home the fact that we are at least at the point, particularly at the younger scholar level, where we can be really clear about some of our differences and not have to be diplomatic all the time when we discuss U.S. China relations. And that's a good place to be. It means that we feel safe in our personal relationships with our colleagues in China and safe in the fact that we are at least united enough where we can dig in on some of these hard issues and be really frank without destabilizing the overall relationship. And I think that's a great place to be. However, we are also still two nations with fundamentally different political systems, and yet we're trying to integrate our economies more deeply than any other nations with such different systems have done before, and also begin to pursue the same type of integration and cooperation on the security side. That is an amazing, ambitious experiment that has never happened before, and we are certainly going to confront some challenges along the way. And one thing that emerged over the past few days of discussion is one of our biggest challenges that we cannot ignore is this challenge of different political systems. The U.S. has, in my personal opinion, the U.S. has for the past few decades approached China with the expectation that economic engagement would lead to democratization. In my personal opinion, the U.S. has been assuming that the Chinese Communist Party would not be our long-term partner, but rather perhaps a short-term partner that would eventually give way to something else. And now we're realizing that that's not what's happened, that actually the Chinese Communist Party has been very successful at reforming the Chinese economy, at bringing many people out of poverty, and that is who we're going to do business with across the Pacific. And I have personally been fascinated with Washington's reaction to the third-party plenum. I think this year I'm beginning to see a shift in how Washington political leaders view their counterparts in Beijing. As a China analyst, I've been working on China for over a decade, and I've gotten used to having to convince people that Chinese party politics is really cool, and they should listen to me talk about things like how the plenum works and why a plenum decision is important. Not this year. This year, everyone wanted to know, months in advance, everyone wanted to know what's going to be in the plenum decision document. And my understanding, what I hear, is that that was brought up at pretty much every high-level leadership meeting between the U.S. and China. And I believe our U.S. leaders are almost perhaps sometimes teasing their Chinese colleagues about the fact that we weren't getting as much foreshadowing and foresight about the plenum decision as we wanted. And I think that shows something new here in the United States. I think that shows a recognition and an understanding that, okay, China has a different political system than we do, but the Chinese leaders of today, that they are people we can do business with, they are people we can work with, and it's in the U.S. interest for Beijing to have a strong and effective and coordinated leadership at the helm, because China is facing a lot of challenges, and the challenges that the Chinese leadership state that they want to overcome are challenges that it will be in the U.S. interests for them to overcome, particularly on economic issues. And so I've seen a new approach between Washington and Beijing that I think is reflected not only in the very high interest on the U.S. side, but also in the high level of interactions between our leaders at the very top level. I believe President Obama and President Hu Jintao met 12 or 13 times during Obama's first term, and there have been many meetings between other counterparts as well. And I believe when our leaders begin to develop these stronger personal relationships over a series of meetings, such as between Jack Liu and Vice Premier Wang Yang, that in itself creates a type of understanding that we didn't have before. And that makes me very hopeful about what we can do going forward. At the same time, I completely agree with Oriana that our differences in political systems, in market systems, means that we do have some fundamental differences in interests. It's not always win-win. Sometimes someone's going to lose, and what we're arguing over is who the loser is going to be. I think if you look at our economic relationship, you can see that there's a clear difference of interests which is generated by our different levels of development. You know, the U.S. was very used to being both a manufacturing power and an intellectual property and technology power. China, as China climbed up the development path, was able to take some of those manufacturing jobs because China had better comparative advantages. Now China is also able to move even further up the chain and compete with the U.S. on some of the higher end technology innovation and production of intellectual property rights. That means that for us, the stakes of competition just got really serious. And there's a possibility that on some economic issues, the U.S. can lose to China. And that makes the U.S. extremely concerned about making sure that any time we lose, that we lost fairly, that it wasn't due to violation of trade rules, that it wasn't due to differences of systems and differences of abilities to oversee local government officials and local enterprises. That is in itself a conflict of interest, because there are companies in the United States, companies in China that are either benefiting or losing in different ways, depending on how our economic relationship is structured. So I personally believe that if our new model of great power relations exercise is going to be successful, then it's going to have to be very strategic in figuring out how do we deal with these issues where we are in direct competition, where it's not win-win, but win-lose, and losing fairly on one side or the other. I think that is where we really want to be working on. How can we have a situation where even if one side loses, we accept that it's a fair game and that we'll get up to play the game another day and we can still be friends and keep the relationship moving along. One thing that emerged particularly throughout the past few days of dialogue is that this exercise of new model great power relations has generated a lot of new terminology, and we often have no idea what that terminology represents. For example, a lot of my Chinese colleagues like to quote the President Xi Jinping's concept that new model great power relations will be based on a premise of no conflict, no confrontation. But I think that some on the U.S. side are suspicious that what that means is we're going to do new things and you leave us alone. and don't react to things that we do. And I believe perhaps the recent movements on the air defense zone, I leave security issues to Oriana, but that seems to me to be an issue where China is hoping that it can take new steps and the U.S. not react in a negative way. And the U.S. might have a very different perception of what no conflict, no confrontation would mean. So this exercise is only going to be meaningful to the degree that we really dig into not just lofty concepts, but what the actions mean in practice. What actions will China take? What actions will the U.S. take? And when those actions would conflict with one another, what are we going to do to make sure that whoever loses out is going to feel like the game was played fairly and we can come back again tomorrow?
Thank you, Melanie. I'd like to first put a question to the whole panel and then take questions from the audience. But continuing with your last point, using the ADIZ, the Air Defense Identification Zone, as a case, I think we all recognize that this new model, and I'm not going to say the whole phrase because I get tired of saying it. There are too many syllables. We need a new word for whatever this is going to be. It's aspirational. We don't have it yet. Neither side thinks we're there. So the question is, how will we know when we're there? There need to be milestones or markers. And so taking the current situation in the East China Sea, for both the Chinese and American participants, how would the past week have played out differently if we already had this new kind of relationship? Would, for example, China have consulted with us or with other involved parties beforehand? Would the United States have not flown two B-52s across the zone immediately? Would China perhaps take its case on the Diaoyu Senkakus to the International Court of Justice? Is multilateralism part of this new relationship? Or would the United States not, over the past year or so, been so clear about reiterating that, in fact, its defense treaty with Japan did include the Diaoyu Senkakus? Is that something that China would see as a sign of sincerity? So I just put it out to all four of you. If we already had this relationship, this new relationship, how would the past 2 weeks, or since November 23rd, be different? How would it have played out?
Well, let me address the issues. This has been an aspirational effort to have a new model of relationship. It's premature to frame it as already a reality, not at all. As a matter of fact, we are fully understand and aware of the difficulty or the problems we need to tackle before reaching that kind of goal. But having said that, we should make our every efforts first. It always start from the first one. So your question about this new model relationship and then the air zone issues. Let me just make this point. As a matter of fact, this air zone issue, China notify United States before declares. So this has been a very, very important measure China has been taken against this backdrop. The backdrop is no surprise, right? We should take every major step and without risking surprise the other. I think this already gradually merging as a consensus. So this air zone issue, I think the United States shouldn't feel surprised at all because we notify you beforehand. And after all, China have every reason, have every right to declare it because Japan already have it more than 40 years ago, and it covers Diaoyu Islands. So of course, the people here, I mean, it's a little overreaction, overreact about this. And one of the arguments or the charge is China is trying to change the status quo. You know what I'm thinking about it? I think the status quo no longer exists since last year when Diaoyu Island has been so-called nationalized by the Japanese. So this air zone is just a response, the latest response to that.
Do you know, I don't know that it's been reported that China had informed the United States beforehand. I don't know if any of you have read this, but it hasn't been certainly in the mainstream media. Do you, Oriana?
So there's a number of issues here. First of all, it's always been China's policy, and if you read their addendum to UNCLOS, for example, it's always been China's policy that other countries have to ask permission to transit what China considers, its territorial waters and its territorial airspace. The problem is, one, that the ADIZ is seen as a change to the status quo because it did change what China said it was going to do and how it was going to implement. All of a sudden, they were going to implement this policy. What's concerning is also the difference we have in interpretation of innocent passage. So a part of the difference in interpretations is that in the United States and in most countries in international law, if you have a vessel that is transiting through waters in the EEZ, they're allowed to do so. And China thinks that if you are a military vessel or military aircraft, by your very nature, you can't be innocent, right? This is one of these issues that we just disagree on. I just wanted to say about how this would be different if we had a new type of relationship. First of all, I don't know if that means equal power or not. I think a different question would be if the United States and China were actually equals in stature in the international system, would this have gone down differently? Absolutely, right? But is that different than saying, what if we had a different type of relationship? Also, I wonder, right now, China heavily relies on coercive diplomacy in dealing with its territorial claims. Coercive diplomacy is just this sort of these implicit threats that force could happen at some point if you don't adhere or cooperate with us diplomatically. And I'm not sure if China were stronger or more confident, if they felt like they could convince countries to respect their claims, and the days they lost that battle, they thought it was a fair loss and they lived to fight another day, that maybe they wouldn't so heavily rely on those tools. But at least from my perspective, the ADIZ was, I completely expected it. As someone who's studied these disputes for a very long time, it's very standard for the Chinese to do something what I call the manipulation of risk. They introduce risk of operation on purpose to increase the possibility that there's an accident, to convince other players to not operate in those areas. So this is standard by-the-book practice, and you're perfectly right. Every country has their right to declare their ADIZ, and China has taken that right. But I just want to note that I think it's interesting that Professor Lee, in his discussion of status quo, even status quo we don't see eye to eye on. In the United States, it's something that doesn't change. In China, he used words of change to describe the status quo, like a gradual evolution, flexibility of the system. And I get the point. Why should the status quo be the past 200 years? Why isn't it the past 2000, in which China was the dominant power in the region? So I think it's just interesting, even that we are actually thinking of different things when we're using the same terms.
Professor Lee.
Okay. Actually, with regard to the ADIZ, I would highlight that it is a kind of a policy that China tried to comply by the international norms. There are so many countries established their own ADIZ. More than 20 countries have their ADIZ. Why can't China? Okay, when China established ADIZ, many countries actually accepted. And the United States, and actually to some extent, or to a large extent, induced by some other countries to overreact to China's policy of establishing ADIZ. Okay. However, we noticed that the Joe Biden's visit to China, actually had played some positive role that to soften, actually through the dialogue with China's counterparts. The United States actually has softened its hard stance formerly he held in dealing with China's establishment of air defense identification zone. With regard to the status quo, actually, the status quo, the definition is much more important. Okay, the status quo should actually be defined by the Carroll, or we can say Carroll Declaration and the Potsdam Proclamation. in which in which China, the United States, Britain, all emphasized that all the territorial and islands that Japan stolen or occupied should retain to the hands of China. Okay. However, the contemporary actually contemporarily speaking, and the support from the United States to a large extent, okay, the Japan actually takes some actions of changing or refuting the legitimacy of the major documents or agreements actually made by the victories in the World War II. So it is very important for us to define the status quo. Okay, that is my explanation. Okay.
Thank you. I would say I was trying more to conduct a thought experiment about the new model of major power relations rather than to judge the merits of the ADIS, but it's certainly an interesting discussion. Melanie, any thoughts before we go to the audience?
Sure. So I think we all have to recognize that the status quo or the current situation in the Asia Pacific is one that isn't going to serve us in the long term. China has become the dominant global economic power in the region, but isn't integrated into the regional security architecture. And it only makes sense that China will have a growing role in that security architecture as it grows in power. I think China hasn't figured out what that role is going to look like, what the responsibilities are going to entail, and the U.S. also hasn't figured out what that role is going to look like. So I would hope that as we move forward with the new model of U.S.-China relations, it's a model where we understand what our respective roles are on the security side in the Asia-Pacific, just as we do on the economic side. And second, I also think that over time, perhaps China may hopefully become used to the fact that all of China's actions are going to be viewed as highly important and of great concern to many other nations in the region and around the world. In the United States, we're used to being judged and criticized at every turn. We're used to having all of our actions questioned and investigated because we're a very powerful nation and because the actions the U.S. takes have a ripple effect throughout regions and throughout the world. China is now a powerful nation and is becoming more powerful by the day. With great power comes great scrutiny. And so my hope is that China will grow more comfortable with that scrutiny and better able to predict the kind of reactions that Chinese actions might generate.
Well, thank you. Any questions now, comments from the audience? We have a microphone. Yes, right. First hand up. Yes, thank you.
I'm Helen Rafael. I taught environmental science at Sichuan University in Chengdu in 2000-2001. And I'm very conscious of the fact that northern China is running out of water. Both groundwater and the Huanghe is getting depleted part of the year. And I fervently wish, and of course we also, global warming is causing water shortage all over the world. I fervently wish that we could cooperate strongly and quickly and effectively with China in combating global warming. Dr. Hart, since it's your topic, what do you think are the prospects? It seems to be a difficult situation at the moment.
Well, I think first of all, from the U.S. perspective, we have to recognize that we don't always live up to our own global warming responsibilities as much as we should. So while we should push China to do more action, we have to also be taking care of business at home as a first step. Secondly, I am personally very optimistic about China's growing feeling of responsibility and growing action on the issues of air pollution and climate change. That is due largely because of China's own domestic interests. China has a very large middle class. China's new middle class wants clean air just as much as they want a healthy economy. The Chinese leadership is responding with some really fascinating and interesting air cleanup programs that are going to have a big impact on global climate change. I think our biggest challenge in the near term is making sure that while the U.S. and China are struggling to balance our international responsibilities with our domestic hopes and obligations, that we make sure we're focusing our diplomatic efforts on reducing the types of climate pollutants that have the biggest bang for the buck and the biggest near-term impact. This past summer, the U.S. and China made an agreement to cooperate on the phase down of HFCs. That is a short-lived climate forcer that heats up the globe much faster than many other pollutants, and that's the kind of thing where we can focus our near-term efforts to really slow the pace of global climate change in the short term, while also doing the long and gritty work at home to change the orientation of our economies. But overall, I'm very optimistic, and I see the biggest push on China as coming from within that nation, not from the United States.
Right in the middle, sir.
Sorry, McDonald Homer with USAID. This first speaker spoke to the issue of convergence of U.S. and China interests. How does that play out in Africa? Where are the areas of convergence in the African context?
Well, it can be a growing area, growing point for China and the U.S. to be cooperative in Africa. And there's a kind of different perceptions about Africa. For China, there's a popular perception about China. China is a latecomer. China like to just take the energy and the resources. So every China's performance or its efforts in Africa being characterized just the energy, so to speak, issue. As a matter of fact, China has a long tradition of very good friendly relationship with the Africans. And China's business communities, they're also learning to exercise their social responsibility. For example, help to build the school, hospital, basic infrastructure, and also for example, to help even Sudan to the capacity building for its energy industry, all these sort of things. And I think maybe one of the areas for China and the U.S. to work together is about, for example, training the talents. For example, how to help the Africa. I mean, China has some expertise and it also has a little more money, extra money, and the U.S. maybe has yours advantages. So why not put together to kick off a kind of training program to help the capacity building in Africa, and also to combat improve the health system, the health issues, and of course, ultimately, the development in Africa has been a very tremendous task, a massive undertaking, and China and U.S. will also working hand in hand. And even after that, 2015, the Millennium Goals, we should carry on to do more on that.
So up front. Oh, there's a microphone.
Nguyễn Mạnh Hồng from George Mason University. I have a question for the last speakers. When you talk about China's perception or view of status quo in East Asia, and you mentioned the Potsdam and the Cairo declarations. I'm wondering, you could enlighten us on what would be Chinese view of the status quo in the China Sea, South China Sea, and to what extent that view play into the building of the new power relationship between the two major countries.
Actually, Cairo Declaration and the Potsdam Proclamation actually the important and extremely authoritative documents, which actually lay the ground for the stability of the regional order in East Asia in post-World War II. Okay. And the legitimacy of the two documents should be actually recognized and actually and could and the fact is in the post World War II and many countries in the Asian actually indeed recognize that kind of legitimacy of the Cairo Declaration, the Potsdam Proclamation. Okay. Actually, with regard to the South China Sea, China emphasized that sources of conflicts between some nations exist, but that kind of sources of conflicts should be eliminated through dialogue. And if that kind of source of conflicts cannot solve now, we should keep the momentum of enhancement of our dialogue till the issue was resolved in the end. Okay, thank you.
Sure. It's okay, just walk. You can give him that one.
Thank you very much. I have a question. My name is Mizumoto from Jiji Press. I have a question, Mr. Luan. And just I want to make sure about your comment about ADIZ. And you said China has notified ADIZ to U.S. before China declared it. And then it's very important. In which level, who told ADIZ to whom in the U.S. government? Could you describe more?
Well, you expected too much. You expected too much. So that's as far as what I can tell you is that as far as I understand or I know, we did notify that before any kind of declares of ADIZ. So that's I think that's quite enough. That's quite enough.
If I could just say, I mean, I haven't heard of that, but I also don't think it changes much. You know, there was no consultation. If there were, the United States would have been very clear on our position that we don't support the current rules. And so, if China had, which I haven't heard, you know, the day before they set it up, called the president and say, "Oh, by the way, we're doing this," I don't think it really changes the implications or, you know, how the region felt about it afterwards.
I don't want to sound very cynical, but all the reactions, even from the United States and Japan, all this reaction, what we can expect otherwise. So it's a kind of not surprise for me, at least, not surprise for me. But the point is that I should make it clear, this establishment of ADIZ, as a matter of fact, it has the positive value on that. So far, it has been very elective, been perceived or discussed, or protested, all this sort of thing. We have to also look at the flip side, the other side of this. It demonstrates China's transparency. Every time you guys ask China, you should be more transparent about what you want. Now, China tell you what we want, right? we tell you what we want. And also, the other point I like to add, it will help reduce the miscalculations. We tell you what we want, right? So you know you are going to expect what will be the consequences, unintended consequences, if we don't comply or whatever. I don't know. So here is, you should encourage China to speak up, to tell you what we really like to do in the region. Overall, as I said, well, let me put it this way. There is a convergence of interest between the United States and Japan. But in the same time, I should also appreciate Americans' efforts, its response is slightly different from, or a kind of different from that of the Japan's. So the reaction here, I must give some credit to American side, has been measured. So of course this is a positive, a lolly love, but certainly we encourage this kind of interaction will be carried on. Of course, you said, well, it doesn't change anything. But for us, it is a big deal for us to tell you that.
Can I just add really quickly about the coercion aspect, just to highlight two of the points I made. Again, I think the problem is not misunderstanding. We understand the Chinese position, the Chinese understand ours, we just disagree. I think this is a good highlight of that. And second of all, we feel the introduction of risk. Right, the point was made, and this is a standard Chinese strategy of we've made a statement, and now if you go into this area, you're taking on risk of operations. That is a coercive measure, and that's what makes, I think, the United States feel uncomfortable.
And if I could add something in the context of U.S. China relations, because you spoke about America having a more measured response, and there has been from the Chinese foreign ministry and other people there, they were glad that the United States, through the FAA, recommended to commercial carriers that they comply with the ADIZ, which the Japanese didn't do. And there's been some suggestion that the Chinese side is trying to use this distinction to create some daylight between Japan and the United States on this issue. But as an American who doesn't follow China constantly, what I would be worried about from the Chinese point of view is the message this gives to America is commercial airlines, please comply, because if you don't, there's a chance that China might blow you out of the sky. And this is up to the message received, not message intended, but message received is this is the reason for the recommendation. And that message wasn't out there before November 23rd. I mean, that seems to me like a legitimate way for Americans to interpret that difference. And I wanted to give you a chance to respond to that because we were on the radio show earlier today and you didn't get a chance to respond. So I wanted to put that out.
Well, thank you very much. I think I should clarify one thing. The ADMZ, Advanced Airline Defense Identification Zone, is different. It's not equivalent to territorial airspace. It is very different. It is just to give you a more warning buffer zone to identify what kind of aircraft. Second point is the Chinese Foreign Ministry made it very clear and repeatedly, it does not affect any kind of civilian airlines at all overfly in the region. So I think I have to repeat those two points.
Yeah. Ambassador, Madam Ambassador, right.
Julia Chang Block, U.S. China Education Trust. First, let me say it's very refreshing to hear from young leaders, younger voices, younger China experts. But you know, I'm curious. I really haven't heard too much differences from the younger voices compared with the not so younger voices. And I wonder whether in your dialogue you discerned, Melanie referred to some differences in approach, but whether in your dialogue you discerned any major differences in views between the younger and the older. Because as the younger generation takes over, can we be hopeful or just the opposite on whether we can establish a new model of major power relations?
I invited some of the young, but did not count myself among them. So I'll defer to you. Answer that, please.
I guess I would disagree with your assessment. Maybe there's some people of the older generation that hold these same views, but I guess my comments were actually directed at precisely these frameworks that have been set up by established scholars that I don't understand the empirical accuracy of, like the framework of strategic mistrust that is used around town and is considered, something put out by the Brookings Institute. It has been the view, I think, and the majority of the time I've studied China, that we have all these areas of cooperation, right? If we just focus on the areas of cooperation, then somehow this will build goodwill and resolve all those problem areas for us without having to think about it. So I think that's definitely different. I think there's different emphasis, and Melanie can talk more about the domestic political system, but I'm much more comfortable with the idea of dealing with China as it is now than I think some of my older counterparts. It doesn't seem strange to me that we have a rising power that isn't a democracy. I don't see things in the framework of the Cold War because I don't remember it. I didn't live it. I don't know anything about the Soviet Union. And so I think the lack of hostility, the fact that, again, you go to China, you have friends in China, as Robert said. So I do think that some of the frameworks, at least maybe I wasn't that clear, but the way of thinking about China of, but there's all these areas we can cooperate on, and what about this economic stuff? And I'm sure we'll have this peaceful process of political change. I don't see that happening. And that's the message. When I was, younger, going through graduate school, I'd sit at these sort of panels and I'd look up at those people and think, what are they talking about? Maybe if they had studied in mainland China instead of Taiwan, they would actually understand what the Chinese views are. And so I think some of those differences are still there.
And my personal opinion is that the younger generation understands where the limits of joint action are on both sides. Because I know, for example, one big issue here in the United States is respect for intellectual property rights. But if you spend a lot of time in mainland China and you see there are real political limitations to automatically creating a beautiful court system, just like we have in the United States, that is going to have the same type of protection for intellectual property rights. That's not going to happen in the near term. And so, therefore, we need something else. We need some kind of middle way, some kind of accommodation system for the fact that that isn't going to change overnight, just like Washington isn't going to fix our budget problems overnight. I think the younger generation understands the political lines of possibility and current impossibility on both sides a little bit better than some of our predecessors. And I think that's reflected also in how we are all responding to the third-party plenum. There's a lot of ambitious reforms put forward in the decision document that was released last month. And I know that the U.S. wants China to move really quickly on everything in the decision document and address, send the Chinese consumers surging ahead so they can buy U.S. products and address some of our trade imbalances. But I'm also well aware that there are interests in China that will lose out from moving too quickly from some of those reforms. So I can see, I think, with greater understanding of the political interests on the Chinese side, I can see perhaps areas where the U.S. isn't going to get exactly what it wants in the near term, and those systems are going to remain more different than perhaps we would like in the near term. So perhaps we need some outside of the box thinking so that we can still work very closely together, even while maintaining a little bit far apart in the way we do things.
Professor Ron, I know you speak with a lot of Americans of many generations. Do you want to answer this question? Is there any difference at all? Sorry to put you on the spot.
Well, I'm no longer young. So I look like I'm young. Thank you very much. I think the point, it impressed me so much in the last two very intensified meeting of the young leaders, is that each side is very tentatively listen to the others, no matter how sharp, how direct the question or comments are. So this is a kind of very, very positive, manner of dialogue with each other. And, well, the fundamental point is for China, as China become stronger and more prosperous, and lots of expectation on China to play a bigger role. But in the same time, as just my colleagues ever mentioned, that the economic ties does not necessarily transfer to a friendly relationship. Sometimes it can be a double-edged sword, right? The worry about they're too dependent on you, so you got the bigger leverage on me and use that as a tool. All this played out, that means China will surely be under the scrutiny for a long time. But many of my colleagues, they don't quite understand this. They don't even appreciate. But for young leaders, I think it's easier, it's more open to understand the others, their feeling, or others' perception about China. So we're not getting so emotional when different views come into us or just direct us. We will take it sometimes for granted. Well, yeah, they have every right to have the different view on China. So we don't expect everybody say, well, China is good, China is beautiful. We also have a preparation psychologically prepare for some otherwise comments on China. So I think this is the value of the young leaders dialogue.
Question up on the side.
Thank you. My name is Yoshihide Soya, Professor of Political Science of Keio University. Right now, Japan scholar here at the Wilson Center. I basically came here to learn about Sino-U.S. relations, and I tried to remain silent, but since Japan came up, please allow me to make two comments. One as a Japanese, and the other one, hopefully not necessarily. One is about the point which Dr. Ram made about the nature of so-called nationalization of Senkaku Islands by the Japanese government as a sort of challenge to the status quo. Our take is, of course, totally the opposite. This was, in fact, the transfer of property rights. So nationalization is a wrong word. Transfer of property rights from a private citizen who used to own the islands to the government. So for which government paid money, lots of money. So the purpose was to prevent the transfer of property rights from the citizen to the governor of Tokyo. And if the governor of Tokyo would have bought it, that would certainly have led to the destruction of the status quo. So the purpose of the government, preventing each other from buying, but government itself buying the island, was an action to preserve the status quo. I think that's the essence of Japanese decision. So for the Chinese government to use it as a sort of pretext, excuse to do whatever it does, I think that's okay, that's understandable. That's Chinese diplomacy. But for scholars to interpret this that way, I think we should have a second thought. And the second point about Dr. Lee's repeated reference to Cairo Declaration and Potsdam Declaration. I think the country which accepted and respected those two declarations as the foundation of post-war regime is none other than Japan. Post-war Japan was built on the basis of accepting those. Then came post-war constitution and U.S.-Japan alliance and giving up all the territories. We gave up Taiwan, right? And so we pretty much lived the post-war years on the basis of accepting those premises and respecting the post-war regime. And how this is made an issue by the Chinese side. Again, I understand this as an action by the Chinese government as part of its diplomacy. It's basically about Daoyu Senkaku.
Thank you. We actually spent quite a bit of time talking about Japan, and while it was clear that it was, in our conference, so we know it's a very important issue in U.S. China relations, but I do want to bring it back in the few minutes that we've got to this question of whether the U.S. and China can actually achieve.
Can I generalize this in a broader context?
Okay, as briefly as possible because we're running out of time, but yes, please.
Sorry. So if this needs to be, judged, in an objective way, I think there should be no other place than ICJ to settle this. whether this is really part of or outside of that. And for China to live under the premises of post-war regime, I think this could be one important issue to discuss in the context of U.S.-China relations as well. Sorry for being long. Yeah.
A quick answer, Professor
just two-finger interventions. Well, two very brief comments. The first one, what you said, as a matter of fact, it turned out to reinforce my observation. We do have disputes perspective on the dialog islands, but so far Japan has resisted, has denied any kind of dispute for that. So for China's part, we ask it that now here this is a dispute, but we should move on by shaving the disputes or differences. Second point is you just say blame everything on China. Japan is so innocent. And you know now, currently in Beijing, we have a very important campaign by Xi Jinping called criticism and self-criticism. So critic others is very easy, it's a softball, but self-criticism is really, really hot and tough. And
okay, one down front, please.
Thank you. Dave Rabinowitz. I'd like to get back to the question of status quo, and specifically, we're talking about a new model, a new arrangement for relations between U.S. and China, and I'm wondering if there's a consensus on what the current arrangement is.
I didn't quite
This came up, and I think the answer is no, right? Anyone else from the conference want to handle that?
Different views.
We did talk quite a bit about who was raising a challenge to the status quo, but I'm not sure we did agree on what the status quo is. Professor Lee?
Actually, both sides accused the other to change the status quo. The fact is, it is very urgent for the scholars and politicians to sit together to talk about the definition of status quo, right? Indeed, actually, China does not change the status quo, and why? Because contemporary status quo in East Asia regional order provide a very sound environment for China's peaceful development or China's prosperity. There is no benefit for China to challenge the status quo. Why our the United States accused of China changing the status quo? Actually, we should enhance our mutual understanding through dialogue. Yeah, this is why the participants from China, from American sit together to hold this conference. Okay, thank you.
Well, way at the back, Mr. Chen.
Hi, Chen Wei Hua, China Daily. Yeah, I have a question. I mean, a major part of this new model of relationship is obviously how to manage the differences. So I would ask the panel to grade China and the U.S. On this case of East China Sea at this, and their response. I mean, how they handle these differences. Would you give them a pass or a fail? Thank you.
Well, you want to start?
That's a tough one. I would say first and foremost, I think we've discussed this of how we see the differences should be managed, which on the Chinese side is the view that the United States needs to accommodate China's interests more. And on the United States side, you avoid conflict by China adhering to international law and norms and working within institutions. So we said this in the conference, there's a tendency to want other countries to judge you based on what you say your own intentions are, but then you judge others based on how their actions affect you, right? Which are two different things. I think for the United States, what we're doing is we're basically a kid hiding in the closet and thinking if we close our eyes and we can't see anyone, that in hide and seek, no one is going to see us, which is basically just ignore what, we say, China, we don't recognize this, and we just sort of pretend that everything's the same. We go about business as usual. We're going to fly our aircraft. We're going to, do whatever we're going to do to try to maintain the status quo as we understand it. The Chinese view of the status quo is that the status quo is the rise of China, right? And so from their view, I think as long as you can keep on moving that forward, they're succeeding. So at least when I read some Weibo, some Chinese Twitter interpretations of what happened in the 80s, everyone made up their own narrative for how they could give themselves a thumbs up. The United States, we did it, right? We said, you know, we say we don't respect this, and we flew our B-52s to show we don't respect it. China Twitter said that the United States chose to use this antiquated aircraft, the B-52, to show basically its compliance with the ADIZ. So in the end, we both gave ourselves a thumbs up, but we're both, you know, like the quacking, and we're both just talking past each other, and we're going to try to ignore this, you know, we're just going to try to move forward and ignore the fact that we have this severe conflict of interest that we need to deal with.
Okay, I would add some words. Okay. With regard to the East China Sea and the South China Sea, based on my observation, there are any fundamental conflicts between China and the United States. For the United States, the core interest is the freedom of flight and the freedom of navigation. From China's side, China never denied the U.S. the right to, you know, freedom of flight, freedom of navigation. So there exists the misunderstanding of the conflict between the two sides regarding the South China Sea and East China Sea between the United States and China. So it is necessary for two sides to have a serious talks to eliminate that kind of misunderstanding. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, one very briefly comment to that. So the status quo, to keep the status quo, is just like an effort to chasing a moving target, as a matter of fact. So it is always moving. And it is also, back to the question, it is pretty mature to give any yes or no answer for that. So, but as I understand, there is a growing convergence of interest for both China and the United States. We have a great stake in secure the peace and stability in the region. And so I think this will prevail for us. So I think it will turn out to be a kind of plus for the new model of great power relationship.
So right in the middle, then we'll go over here.
Thank you. David Sadney, formerly of the Defense and State Departments. Two questions. The first is, Robert, you said your question was, can the U.S. and China move forward on this formulation of a new great power relationship? But since I left government, I've been traveling in many places around the world, and the question I think a lot of people outside the U.S. and China would ask is, should the United States and China be formulating a great power relationship? Are we arrogating to ourselves a role as key superpowers, and by doing so ignoring the multipolarity of the rest of the world? So did that question come up in your discussions? Is actually this kind of discussion the kind of discussion that should be taking place in today's world? And the second question for all of you, but especially for you, Robert, you mentioned the new U.S. scholars, but are there young Chinese scholars under the age of 35 or so who have different views than the older Chinese scholars who are over the age of 35?
We did, I think on both the Chinese and the American sides, people kept on bringing the discussion back into a multilateral context. I think there was a very regular attempt to do that, and and I think that we were aware, although we didn't talk about it too much, that some people see this as a relaunch of the G2 idea. There was I didn't hear anybody in the conference who was advocating for anything like that. In fact, what I heard for the most part in this conference, which is, and maybe I heard this because this is my view, that really when we say the new type of great power relations, 新型大国关系, this is just the fashionable way of saying 中美关系, U.S. China relations, at the moment. So it ended up being more a conference about U.S. China relations, and we kept coming back to what is new about this, and not getting satisfactory answers even from ourselves. So I think, yes, nobody here was advocating for a G2. There was awareness that there's resistance to that, and there was a great deal of interest in multilateralism. So it wasn't, if I've interpreted your question correctly, I don't think anyone at the conference was looking for a way to have this be a new G2 kind of arrangement. regarding younger Chinese scholars, I think I would defer to Professor Li and Professor Ran in that part of the question.
Well, I really like to back to the first one. I also have a thought on that. I absolutely agree with you that it is not a G2 notion whatsoever. It's too much for us, too much for us. And what I like to see is that this new model of great power relationship, and for Chinese observers, as I said, well, it is a pretty positive for Chinese to take the initiative in proposing this notion. And you know, for a certain time again, and people urge China to shoulder greater responsibility, to do more. You should not be a free rider. So China now said, yes, we like to do something with the United States of America. So this is surely a part of efforts from the Chinese sides. Jointly, hopefully, we can shape the future orientation of this relationship. And to the younger generations, maybe you are younger than I am.
No. We're the same age. Okay. No. Okay. Actually, with regard to the G2, actually, China officially don't accept that the concept because China is very realistic about its power, and China now is willing to take international responsibility, but that responsibility should match China's overall current power. Okay, thank you.
Toward the back, yes, sir.
Richard Scorza from the Foreign Affairs Training for East Asia. Question to the panel is something I've been asking myself is, why don't we have this conundrum with a great power, a large country like India? And it occurs to me that that the legacy of World War II is a persistent part of our relationship now, not only because the U.S. has a number of allegiances and alliance commitments in the aftermath of the war, but the very internal factor of India being a robust democracy and China being an authoritarian communist regime with the Red Army and the Communist Party in charge. So it looks to me like the answer to your question for your conference is no, it's not possible, because the adversarial basis is inherent in the makeup of the country, and simply look to a divergence of a model like the one we have with India, and it's pretty clear that none of these problems are solvable, and that perhaps old models are probably more likely to transpire in the future.
This was actually a major topic in the conference. We have very quick answers. We have time for one last question because we've been very patient. So we'll get to you in just a minute. Quick answers, please, then one more question.
If I can say something about India real quick, because I'm actually in the middle of writing something on China's views on India. I don't think it's a fair comparison. I get your point. The United States does see India differently because it's democracy, but I kind of buy the Chinese literature on India that, like, who invented this idea that India is rising, right? They've had economic growth, and it's not been as impressive. I don't think it's fair to compare sort of what has happened in China and how much China has changed in the power accumulation with India. I don't see them as the same thing.
I would just underscore that you can compare the Chinese versus Indian GDP per capita. There are big differences, and those differences in the type of advancements that China and India are making, the type of ambitions that those two countries have, that means the stakes are very different from the United States when we're confronting China versus India. But I would flag that for those of us that follow climate change issues, we have plenty of conflicts and disputes with India at this particular moment. So it's not always wine and roses with democracies either.
One last question.
Thank you. Bing Ruang with Hong Kong Phoenix TV. I just want to know your assessment of yesterday the Defense Minister Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel said it's not the ADIZ itself is new or unique. The U.S. biggest concern here is how it was done so unilaterally and so immediately without any consultation. First of all, do you think the U.S. has softened its tone? Second, if the U.S. doesn't have veto power here, why the consultation is important? Thank you.
We'll give the last answer to you, Professor Ron.
It's a question for me? I thought it's asking my American friends. Maybe it's a final thought about this. I think the U.S. is, of course, U.S. is become more sensitive now than it used to because of the financial crisis, because of the rise of the rest of the world. And so very much we hope the U.S. economies will recover and become more confident on that. And secondly, I think the U.S. has already voiced their differences on this ADIZ, and they already make the point. That's very clear. And in the same time, I think I have to repeat my one last observation is that its response is changing, it's evolving, not changing, it's evolving in different time frame, right? If you compare the first reaction in the middle time frame and to the last few minutes, it is very interesting paradigms. And I think for us, we should try to appreciate this kind of adjustment. And so to read the understatement. What Americans say is very important, but in the same time, we should also try to understand what Americans not say. What is that word, or what is that meaning that they don't say? So that is equally important.
Thank you very much for coming today. No doubt all these conversations will be continued. We hope to see you here again soon. Thank you.